The flour on the table moved before she felt the wind. A fine white dusting lifted off the wood, drifted sideways across the cabin, and settled against the far wall in a line as thin as a pencil mark. The stove ticked, cooling. A 6-year-old girl stood in the doorway holding a wooden button, watching a man on a dun horse circle the cabin like he was measuring a coffin. He pressed his palm flat against the west wall and held it there. When he pulled it away, he looked at his hand the way a man looks at a wound he did not expect. The girl tugged her mother's sleeve. "Does the wind live inside our house?" she asked. Beret Brecka was 24 years old the summer the freight wagon killed her husband. Aaron had been hauling lime and nails from Fort Benton, 40 pounds of each stacked behind the seat, when the right wheel dropped into a coolie wash and the wagon rolled. The teamster who brought the news said Aaron's neck broke on the first turn. "He did not suffer," the man said. He said that twice, as though repetition could make it a gift. That was May of 1886. By June, Beret stood inside a 16 by 20-foot log shack on Cottonwood Creek in Fergus County, Montana Territory, with a 6-year-old daughter named Clara, 1 milk cow, 2 hens, a cracked cook stove, a claim receipt with her name freshly written beside her dead husband's, and $17.40 folded into a leather envelope she kept inside her dress. She owed Gideon Sauter's General Store for lime, coffee, axle grease, nails, and winter flour. The debt ledger sat in Sauter's desk, and the number in it was larger than the number in the envelope. She could not leave. The Homestead Act required residence, improvements, and farming before she could prove up. If she walked away, she lost the claim, lost every hour Aaron had spent raising walls, lost the only property her daughter would ever inherit. She had no relatives nearer than Iowa. She had no money for passage. She had a piece of paper that said this land was hers if she could survive on it, and a piece of paper that said she owed a storekeeper who would be happy to take the land when she could not. The shack had 72 feet of exterior wall. Only the north side was properly chinked. Aaron had finished that wall first because he understood wind. The west wall had gaps between the logs wide enough to push 2 fingers through. When the wind blew from the northwest, which it did most evenings, Beret could feel the air cross the floor like a river running through her house. The stove ate cottonwood the way a sick animal drinks water, constantly and with no sign of satisfaction. She fed it every 30 minutes and the cabin stayed cold. She had 1 1/4 cords of cottonwood stacked against the east wall. The wood was punky, half green, cut from deadfall along the creek. It burned fast and gave weak heat. In a mild winter, it might last 6 weeks. In a hard winter, it would not last through December. 3 weeks after Aaron's funeral, a man named Amos R. Pritchard rode up to the shack on a dun horse and dismounted without being invited. He was 56 years old, a former Army post carpenter who had built cabins across the Judith Basin for a decade. People trusted his eye the way they trusted a doctor's hand. He walked the perimeter of Beret's cabin the way a judge walks a courtroom sign, slowly, with the authority of someone who already knows the verdict. He pressed his thumb into the chinking on the north wall, grunted approval, then moved to the west wall. He put his hand flat against the gap between the 3rd and 4th logs and held it there. Wind pushed against his palm. He pulled his hand away and looked at it as though the wind had left a mark. "You have half a house, Mrs. Brecka," he said. He was not cruel about it. His voice carried the weight of a man delivering facts he wished were different. "A roof, yes. Walls, barely. A stove that drafts like a church bellows." He walked the south wall, knelt at the sill, stood, and continued to the east. When he completed the circuit, he stood facing her with his hat in his hands and the wind pulling at his collar. "How much wood do you have stacked?" he asked. 1 1/4 cords, Beret said. "You need 6, minimum, 6 cords of seasoned hardwood, and you do not have hardwood within 3 miles of this creek. He pointed at the west wall. That gap wants lime mortar and sand. Proper chinking. 2 men. 3 days. You have neither the lime, the men, nor the money. I have some lime, Beret said. You have Aaron's leftover lime, which is maybe 40 pounds in a cracked barrel. You need 200 pounds to chink 3 walls, and lime costs money you told me you do not have. Clara stood in the doorway holding a wooden button she had found in Aaron's toolbox. She watched Pritchard the way children watch adults who are deciding things. She did not speak. Pritchard put his hat back on. Sell the cow, he said. Buy lime and hire the Enger boys for 3 days. That fixes the walls. Then cut wood until you cannot lift the axe. That is the only arithmetic I know that keeps you and the girl alive past January. If I sell the cow, Beret said, Clara has no milk. Pritchard looked at Clara, then at Beret. He did not have an answer for that. There is no good path here, Mrs. Breck, he said. I am telling you the paths that exist. He mounted his horse and rode east toward the Basin Road. Beret watched him go. The wind came through the west wall and lifted the flour dust off the table. Clara sneezed. The stove ticked as it cooled. Beret stood in a cabin that could not hold heat, with wood that would not last, money that would not stretch, and a daughter who coughed when the wind came through the walls. She could not buy what she needed. She could not build what she needed alone. She could not leave without losing everything Aaron had died trying to build. That was the arithmetic. Every number pointed at the same answer, and the answer was failure. But Beret Brecka did not fail that winter, and the reason she did not fail had nothing to do with lime or mortar or 6 cords of hardwood or any of the solutions Amos Pritchard knew to recommend. It had to do with sunflowers. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way most ideas arrive on the frontier, through observation, memory, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who could not afford the obvious solution and therefore had to find one that did not exist yet. In late June, while gathering creek water, Beret noticed something she had walked past 100 times without seeing. Along the bank where an old willow brush pile had collapsed the previous autumn, the snow from the past winter had lingered 3 weeks longer than on the open ground 10 feet away. The grass around the brush pile was green and thick. The grass on the exposed bench was brown and brittle. The same sun hit both. The same air moved over both. But the brush had done something to the snow, caught it, held it, packed it into a dense drift that melted slowly and fed the soil underneath. She stood there with the water bucket pulling at her shoulder and thought about her father. Beret's father, Embret, had farmed in Iowa before the family stopped moving. He was not an educated man, but he watched things the way some people read books, carefully and with the expectation that what he saw would teach him something useful. One winter when Beret was 9, a snowdrift formed against the north side of the sheep barn. The drift was 4 feet deep and packed hard by wind. Embret took Beret inside the barn and pressed his palm against the wall where the drift sat outside. The wall was cold, but it was not breathing. No air moved through it. Then he walked her to the south wall, where the wind hit the bare boards without obstruction. He pressed her hand against the wood. She could feel the draft needling through every crack and knothole. Snow is cold only when the wind owns it, Embret said. He packed loose straw against the south wall's worst drafts, lit a candle, and showed Beret how the flame steadied once the straw blocked the moving air. The cold was still there, but it was still cold, held cold, blanket cold, not the cutting, stealing cold of wind pulling heat from everything it touched. Beret stood at the creek bank in June of 1886 and put those two observations together. The brush pile caught snow. The snow blocked wind. Blocked wind let heat stay. Her cabin bled heat because the wind kept stealing it, racing through the gaps in the west wall, across the floor, up the stovepipe, carrying warmth out faster than the cracked stove could replace it. The problem was not that she lacked fuel. The problem was that wind made any amount of fuel insufficient. She could not buy insulation. She could not afford lime. She could not hire men. But what if she could grow something that caught the wind's own snow and turned it into a wall? The idea was simple. The execution was not. Beret needed a plant that grew tall, grew fast, grew thick, and stood rigid through winter after it died. She needed stalks that would not blow flat in the first November gale. She needed something she could plant close to the cabin walls, dense enough to slow wind and catch drifting snow, but not so dense that wind simply jumped over or scoured around the ends. Common sunflower grew wild along every road ditch and abandoned garden patch in the Judith Basin. She had seen stalks 7 and 8 feet tall standing dead and gray in January, rattling in the wind but not falling. The stems were woody. The heads were heavy enough to boo, but not heavy enough to snap the stalk. Some of the mammoth varieties that settlers had brought from further east grew even taller. She walked the road ditches for 2 days and collected seed heads, cracking them open and sorting the fullest seeds into a flour sack. She bought a small bag of mammoth sunflower seed from Fow's general store, 20 cents, which felt like a fortune. She mixed wild seed with purchased seed and counted what she had. Enough, she calculated, for roughly 600 plants around the cabin's 72-foot perimeter, planted in 4 tight staggered rows beginning 8 inches from the logs and ending 30 inches out. She expected half to fail. If 300 stood by autumn, she would have a crude fence of dead stalks ringing every wall. If the stalks caught snow the way the willow brush had caught snow, and if that snow packed against the logs the way the barn drift had packed against her father's wall, then she would have insulation she had not bought, built from wind she could not stop, and snow she could not prevent. If it failed, she would have wasted a growing season, 20 cents, and whatever water the sunflowers stole from her beans. She tested the principle before she planted. She gathered a bundle of dried weeds from the roadside, drove them upright into a wash tub filled with creek-bottom dirt, and set it on the cabin floor. She sprinkled flour across the dirt surface. Then she told Clara to blow across the wash tub as hard as she could. Clara blew. The flour lifted, swirled, and settled, but not evenly. Behind the standing weeds, where the air slowed and eddied, the flour collected in a tiny white drift. In front of the weeds, the surface was swept clean. The pattern was unmistakable. The stalks did not stop the wind. They slowed it, and where the wind slowed, it dropped what it carried. The stalks would not make warmth. They would make stillness. Stillness would let snow build. Snow would block the drafts that were bleeding her cabin dry. Beret planted the first row on the 28th of June. She pushed seeds into the hard dirt with her thumb, 4 rows deep around the perimeter, spacing them a hand's width apart. The work took 3 days. Her knees bled through her skirt. Her thumbnail cracked. Clara followed behind with a cup of creek water, pouring a mouthful onto each planted seed, solemn as a minister. The risk was real, and she knew every piece of it. The sunflowers would drink water her beans needed. Grasshoppers could strip them bare by August. A loose cow could trample an entire wall in an afternoon. And if snow piled against green logs and melted in spring, the moisture could rot the cabin's sill logs and bring the walls down. She was gambling the house to save the house. But the only other gamble was to do nothing and wait for winter to make the decision for her. Beret Brecka did not wait well. Martha Pell came by on the fourth day, after the planting was done. Martha was 31, a neighbor a mile and a half south, mother of 4 children who ranged from 2 to 11. She was practical the way a plow is practical, designed for one direction, effective, and not interested in detours. She had brought a jar of pickled beets and a reason to inspect. Martha walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking at the disturbed dirt where 600 seeds lay buried. She counted the rows with her eyes. She measured the distance from the stalks to the logs with her gaze. Then she turned to Beret with the expression of a woman who has heard something she needs to say out loud before she can stop thinking it. "You are planting roots against green logs and calling it shelter?" Martha said. "I am planting stalks that will catch snow," Beret said. "Snow against wood is rot, Beret. I've seen it. My uncle lost a granary floor to a drift that sat against the north wall for 3 months. By April, the sill was sponge." "I know," Beret said. "I will dig a drainage trench in the spring." "Spring does not wait for digging. Spring comes, and the water goes where it pleases." Martha set the pickled beets on the stump by the door. "I am not trying to be unkind. I am telling you that water and wood are not friends, and snow is water that has not yet made up its mind." Martha's doubt was not malice. It was the practical objection that any sensible person would raise, and Beret could not fully answer it. The spring rot was a real risk. She did not yet know how to manage it. She only knew that the alternative, an unchinkable cabin in a Montana winter, was not a risk. It was a certainty. "I would rather fight rot in April," Beret said, "than freeze in January." Martha looked at Clara, who was sitting in the doorway drawing shapes in the dust with a stick. Martha's face did something complicated. Sympathy and doubt and fear and respect, all at once, all fighting. "I hope your flowers grow tall," Martha said. She did not sound hopeful. Gideon Sauter rode out in August when the sunflowers had climbed to Beret's waist and the rumor had climbed to his ears. Sauter was 43, storekeeper, small lender, and a man who had learned that other people's misfortune could be purchased at a discount. He held Aaron's unpaid account, lime, coffee, axle grease, nails, winter flour, and the total was written in ink that did not fade. He arrived on a brown gelding with his ledger book in his saddlebag, and his hat tilted at an angle that suggested he had already made up his mind about what he would find. He tied his horse to the stump and walked toward the cabin without greeting Beret, who was on her knees between the second and third row of sunflowers, thinning seedlings that had come up too thick. Sauter walked the perimeter. He did not bend down to examine the plants. He walked upright, the way a man walks property he expects to own soon. When he completed the circle, he stood on the west side and looked at the rows of waist-high stalks crowding against the logs. "Mrs. Brecka," he said. He waited until she stood up and faced him. "I have come to make you an offer that is more generous than you deserve." "I have not asked for generosity," Beret said. "You owe my store $11.60. Your husband signed for those goods. The debt is real, and it is due." He pulled the ledger from under his arm and opened it, though he did not need to read the numbers. He had memorized them. "I will buy this claim for $30 above the debt. That gives you $18.40 free and clear, enough for passage to Fort Benton and a ticket east." "No," Beret said. Sauter closed the ledger. He looked at the sunflowers. Then he stepped into the nearest row and walked through it, and his boots crushed 3 seedlings flat against the dirt. He did not look down. He continued walking until he had crossed all 4 rows and stood with his back against the cabin wall. "These are flowers," he said. "They are not lumber. They are not mortar. They are not men with axes. You are planting a garden where a wall ought to be, Mrs. Brecka, And in January, when this garden is dead and you are cold and your girl is coughing, you will wish you had taken the $30. Beret stepped into his path. She held a hoe in both hands, not raised, not threatening, but present. The distance between them was the width of a sunflower row. You cannot eat yellow flowers in January, Sauter said. No, Beret said, but I can make the wind feed them snow. Sauter smiled the way a man smiles when he has already placed his bet and is waiting for the wheel to stop. He mounted his horse, rode back toward the road, and did not look behind him. The 3 crushed seedlings lay flat in the dirt. Clara came out and tried to stand them up, but the stems were broken. In Fow's store that week, the sunflower cabin became a story. A freighter said the stalks would bring mice. A ranch hand said they would catch fire from the stovepipe spark. Someone, no one remembered who first, called the place the Sunflower Coffin. The name traveled faster than Beret could plant. Sauter did not need to say much. He only needed to be present when others said it, and to nod, and to mention within earshot of Martha Pell and anyone else who might carry the words, "A widow who gardens her walls will soon need someone sensible to manage her land." The social pressure was no longer just gossip, it was economic. Sauter raised her flower price by 2 cents a pound. He did not explain why. He did not need to. Every purchase she made at his store cost more now, and every cent she spent brought the debt closer to the threshold where he could press for the claim. Beret kept planting. She replanted the 3 crushed seedlings with fresh seed from her dwindling supply. She watered them with creek water she carried in 2 buckets, 1 trip every morning, 1 every evening, her shoulders aching and her hands raw from the bale handles. She did not answer the gossip. She did not defend the idea. She pushed seeds into the ground and waited for them to grow. If you have ever built something people could not understand because they could not see what you saw, tell us about it in the comments. The first row broke the surface in July. Thin green threads that looked like nothing. By mid-July, the stems were 6 inches tall and the leaves were spreading. The south wall, which got the most sun, grew fastest. The north wall, which Beret needed most, grew slowest. She carried extra water to the north row until her back seized and Clara had to pull off her boots because Beret could not bend. The work followed a rhythm that was punishing in its monotony. Wake before dawn, feed the stove, milk the cow, collect eggs if the hens had laid, which they sometimes had not, carry water from the creek, 2 trips for the sunflowers, 1 for the garden, 1 for the house. Weed the bean rows, thin the sunflower rows where seedlings grew too close. Check each stalk for grasshopper damage, pinching the green insects between her fingers until her thumb and forefinger were stained brown with their juice. Mend whatever the night wind had loosened. Feed Clara. Feed herself, which she did last, and sometimes not at all. By late July, a hailstorm tore through the basin and shredded the leaves on the west and south rows. The stalks survived. The stems were already woody enough to flex without snapping, but the leaves hung in strips like torn cloth. Beret walked the perimeter at dawn and counted the damage. 43 plants stripped bare, 21 with partial leaves, the rest battered but standing. She almost quit that morning. She stood at the north wall with hail-bruised stems on either side of her and felt the weight of every skeptic's prediction pressing on her chest. Martha was right about rot. Amos was right about wood. Sauter was right that flowers were not walls. She was a 24-year-old widow with cracked hands and a borrowed idea from a sheep barn in Iowa, and the hail had just torn her theory to pieces. Clara came out and touched one of the stripped stalks. "Will it grow back?" she asked. I do not know, Beret said. Papa would have said yes, Clara said. Beret looked at her daughter. Then she knelt in the hail-soaked dirt and began tying the bent stalks upright with strips of cloth torn from a worn-out petticoat. The cloth was white cotton with a blue pattern Erin had liked. She wrapped it around the first stalk and pulled it snug. The stalk straightened. She moved to the next. By August, the hail-damaged stalks had sent out new leaves, smaller but alive. The undamaged rows stood waist-high and climbing. In the morning light, when the dew sat on the broad leaves and the yellow buds were just beginning to show at the tops, the cabin looked like it was wearing a rough green collar. From the road, passing riders slowed their horses to look. Some laughed, some shook their heads. One woman, a rancher's wife Beret did not know, stopped her wagon and stared for a full minute before driving on without speaking. The sunflowers grew, and while they grew, Beret's woodpile did not. She had cut 2 small loads of cottonwood from the creek bottom, adding perhaps a quarter cord to the stack. She needed 5 more cords to meet Amos Pritchard's minimum. She had no saw for heavy timber. She had no horse to drag logs. She had a hatchet, a splitting wedge, and her own back, and the calendar said September was 6 weeks away. The stalks were climbing, the clock was falling, and somewhere between the growing and the counting, winter made its first appearance, not as snow or cold, but as the color of the grass. By late August, the grass on the open bench had gone from green to gold to gray. The creek dropped 2 inches. The mornings carried an edge that was not yet frost, but was frost's ambassador, announcing the arrival of something that would not negotiate. Beret counted her stalks every Sunday. She scratched the numbers on the inside of the cabin door with a nail, the way a prisoner marks days. 320 by late August, chest high and thickening. Not enough. Not nearly enough for the wall she needed. But more than nothing, and on the frontier, the distance between nothing and something was often the distance between dying and not dying. The question was whether something would be enough. That was when Tolef Vangen appeared. He did not introduce himself the way most men on the frontier introduce themselves, with a name, a handshake, and a piece of their history offered like currency. He appeared the way weather appears. He was simply there one morning in early September, standing at the edge of the road where it passed closest to Beret's cabin, watching her tie broken sunflower stalks upright after a wind had bent them in the night. He was 61 years old. He walked with a limp that pulled his left hip forward and made his gait look like a man arguing with the ground. He wore a coat that had once been black and was now the color of creek mud, and his hands were the size of small shovels, scarred across the knuckles from decades of work that had not been kind to him. He was Norwegian-born, though he had been in America long enough that his accent had softened into something that only surfaced on certain words. Yeah for yes, uff for mild disgust, the rolling vowels that came out when he was tired or angry. Tolef had spent 23 years building and maintaining track for the Northern Pacific and the smaller feeder lines that crossed Montana. He had been a section hand, a bridge carpenter, a road maintenance laborer, and finally, when his hip gave out and the railroad decided he was more expensive to keep than to release, nothing. He had a pension of sorts, $14 a month, paid irregularly, and a shack near the Judith River crossing that he shared with no one. He had no family left that he mentioned. He had knowledge that no one had asked for in years. What he recognized in Beret was not desperation. He had seen desperate people. Desperate people prayed over their work and hoped for miracles. Beret was not praying. She was observing. She had tied the bent stalks with cloth strips, but she had tied them loosely, leaving room for the stems to flex. She had noticed, without anyone teaching her, that rigid stalks snapped and flexible stalks survived. Tolliff watched her work for the better part of an hour. Then he walked down from the road and stood at the edge of the sunflower rows. "You tied them wrong," he said. Beret looked up. Her hands were dirty. Her hair had come loose from its pins. She had the expression of a woman who had been told she was wrong so many times that one more opinion was simply weather. "The cloth is too high," Tolliff said. He pointed at a stalk where Beret had tied the support strip near the top of the stem. "Tie it at the middle. The top needs to move. If you hold the top still, the next wind breaks it at the tie point. If you hold the middle, the top waves like a flag, and the roots hold." "How do you know that?" Beret asked. "I planted willow brakes along rail grades for 9 winters," Tolliff said. "Willow, slat fences, brush piles, anything that slows wind and makes snow settle where the railroad wants it instead of where the railroad does not. Your sunflowers are a snow fence. You know that, yeah?" Beret stared at him. No one had named what she was building. She had not named it herself, not in those words. She had thought of it as a wall, a catch, a trick. Snow fence was a term that carried the weight of something real, something that existed in the world beyond her desperate improvisation. "I know that," she said. Tolliff nodded. He looked at the rows with the careful eye of a man who had built similar things under different names. He walked the perimeter the way Amos Pritchard had walked it, but where Pritchard had walked like a judge, Tolliff walked like a student. He stopped at the northwest corner, where the 2 densest rows met, and crouched low despite his bad hip. "Your killing wind comes from there," he said, pointing northwest, "and your rows are even on all 4 sides. That is a mistake." "Why?" "Because the north and west walls need to catch the most snow. The south wall gets sun. Snow melts there first and rots your logs. You want thick on the northwest, medium on the east, and thin or nothing on the south." Beret looked at the south wall where she had planted the same density as every other side. She had wasted seed, water, and weeks of labor on a wall that would work against her in spring. "I did not know that," she said. "Now you do," Tolliff said. He stood up with a grunt that came from his hip, not his throat. "You have another problem. Your stalks are too tight in places. Wind needs to enter the rows, slow down, and drop snow. If the stalks are packed like a solid wall, the wind hits them and jumps over, or it scours around the corners and makes everything worse." He pulled 2 stalks apart with his fingers, showing the gap between them. "This is good. This spacing." He moved 3 feet to the right, where the stalks were nearly touching. "This is bad. This will make an eddy that pulls snow away instead of dropping it." That first morning, Tolliff taught Beret 2 things she had not known and could not have learned from observation alone. By the time he left, she had thinned the south wall rows by half and widened the spacing on the northwest corners in a row. She had lost 30 plants and gained something more valuable, the beginning of an understanding that her idea was not wrong, but her execution needed the knowledge she did not have. Tolliff came back 2 days later with a bundle of willow wands over his shoulder. He showed Beret how to weave the wands horizontally through the sunflower rows, threading them between the stalks like the warp threads of a loom. The willow connected the stalks without making them rigid. When wind pushed one stalk, the willow transferred the force to its neighbors, and they swayed together instead of one snapping alone. "A single stalk is a stick," Tolliff said. "A row of sticks is a fence, but sticks woven together are a wall that bends. Bending is living, stiff is dead." He drove the point home by snapping a dry branch across his knee, one sharp crack. Then he took a bundle of 3 willow wands braided together and bent them in a slow arc. They flexed, held, and returned to straight when he released them. Clara watched from the doorway, holding the wooden button she still carried in her apron pocket. "Like hair," she said. Tolef looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like hair." On his third visit, Tolef taught Beret the lesson that would matter most when spring came, and the lesson she would teach to others after he was gone. He knelt at the base of the north wall, where the lowest log sat on flat stones, and dug a shallow trench in the dirt with a stick. "Snow is a blanket in January," he said. "In April it becomes a thief." He showed her how to pitch the trench away from the cabin sill, angling it so that meltwater would flow outward instead of pooling against the logs. He placed flat stones from the creek under the lowest log where the gap allowed, creating a drainage bed that would channel water away even when the ground was still frozen underneath. "You will want to leave the snow against the walls forever," he said. "It will feel warm and safe. But the moment it softens, you must break the crust on the south side first, then dig channels. The north side can stay. The north side stays cold longest, but the south thaws first, and the water has nowhere to go unless you tell it where." Beret scratched his instructions into the cabin wall with a nail. South first, channels out, break crust before thaw. The relationship between them was not charity and it was not romance. It was the mutual recognition of two people who understood that knowledge was a tool, and tools were meant to be used, not hoarded. Tolef had knowledge that had been useless since the railroad let him go. Beret had a problem that made his knowledge necessary again. He needed to matter. She needed to survive. The partnership was built on that exchange, and both of them respected it without ever naming it aloud. Through September, the sunflowers climbed. Beret kept her tally on the inside of the cabin door, updating it every Sunday with the nail she used for all her records. By mid-September, 490 stalks above her shoulder. The north wall, the killing wall, had 147 standing. The west wall had 131. The east wall had 110. The south wall, thinned on Tolef's advice, had 102 psych, still more than he recommended, but Beret could not bring herself to pull plants she had watered by hand for 3 months. The willow wands held the rows together. The stalks swayed as a unit in the evening wind, producing a dry, rustling sound that Clara said sounded like people whispering. The yellow blooms had opened in August and were now browning, the heavy seed heads bowing forward on their stems. Beret did not harvest them. She needed the weight to keep the stalks grounded, but the progress came with setbacks that arrived at the same pace. In the second week of September, a loose cow, not Beret's, but a rancher's stray that had wandered down from the bench, pushed through the east side rows and broke 11 stalks at the base. The cow stood in the wreckage, chewing sunflower leaves with the vacant satisfaction of an animal that does not understand property. Beret chased it out with a broom and spent the next day replanting what could not be saved and splinting what could. Clara's cough, which had faded during the warm weeks of August, returned in mid-September. She coughed at night, deep, wet sounds that came from her chest and shook her small body. Beret moved Clara's pallet away from the west wall, but the draft crossed the entire cabin. There was no place inside the 16 by 20 foot room where the air was still. A cold rain fell for 3 days in late September, turning Tolef's drainage trench into a muddy trough that pooled against the sill logs instead of draining away. Martha Pell's warning echoed in the mud. Spring does not wait for digging. The rain was not spring, but it was a rehearsal, and the rehearsal went badly. Beret dug the trench deeper, wider, pitching it more steeply away from the cabin. The mud sucked at her boots, and the rain ran down her neck, and the work took 2 days that she should have spent cutting wood. Her woodpile had grown, but not enough. She had 2 cords by October pile, 2 of the 6 Amos Pritchard said she needed. She had cut the cottonwood herself, dragging deadfall from the creek bottom with a rope over her shoulder, splitting rounds with a wedge in the back of the hatchet because she did not own a proper maul. Her hands had gone from cracked to calloused to something beyond both. The skin across her palms was the color and texture of old harness leather, split in places that no longer bled because the flesh underneath had hardened past bleeding. Amos Pritchard rode by in early October. He did not dismount this time. He slowed his horse and looked at the sunflower rose which now stood above Beret's head on the north and west walls, a dense wall of brown and gray and fading yellow. "You grew your flowers," he said. He said it the way a man says something he did not expect, but is not yet willing to call surprising. "I did," Beret said. "They will not hold against a real wind," Pritchard said. "A December blow will lay them flat. Then you will have dead stalks on the ground and no time to replace them." "They are woven," Beret said. "They hold each other." Pritchard looked at the willow wands threaded through the rows. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How much wood do you have?" "2 cords." "You need 6. "I know." 2 cords in a cabin that bleeds heat is not 2 cords, Mrs. Brecky. It is 1. The wind takes the rest. He rode on. Beret watched him go and heard his math repeating in her head. 2 cords that were really 1. 6 cords she would never have. And a wall of dead flowers standing between her daughter and the thing that Pritchard's arithmetic said could not be survived. One unexpected mercy arrived in mid-October. Martha Pell's oldest boy, a serious child of 11 named Jasper, appeared at the cabin carrying 2 bundles of willow branches across his shoulders. He set them at the door and said, "Ma said these are for bean poles." He did not look at the sunflower rose. He did not say the word help. He turned and walked back toward the Pell homestead without waiting for thanks. 3 days later, Beret found a sack of old oakum leaning against the east wall of her cabin. There was no note. The oakum was frayed and dirty, the kind a carpenter might have left over after caulking a floor. She pressed it into the worst gaps in the west wall where the morning air came through sharpest. The oakum was not enough to seal the wall, but it blocked the 4 worst cracks, and blocking 4 cracks was not nothing. She asked Tullough if he had left the oakum. He said no. She did not ask Amos Pritchard. She suspected she knew, and she suspected he would deny it, and she did not want to give him the opportunity to take back the kindness by making him acknowledge it. By first frost, 511 stalks stood around the cabin. Beret scratched the final tally on the door. North, 162. West, 148. South, 91. East, 110. The sunflower heads had gone to seed and bowed forward on their stalks like a congregation at prayer. The stems were gray-brown and dry, hard as broom handles. The willow wands held them in a lattice that flexed in the wind but did not part. The drainage trench had been redug twice and lined with flat creek stones. Beret had grown her wall. Now she needed winter to test it. By Thanksgiving, the sunflowers were dead, frozen, and standing. The yellow was gone. What remained was architecture. 500 gray sentinels arranged in 4 staggered rows around a cabin they had never been bred to protect. Birds tore at the seed heads, scattering husks across the frozen dirt. The stalks rattled in the wind like bones. Neighbors who passed on the road laughed harder now because the wall was no longer a garden. It was a ruin. A woman who refused to cut down dead plants was worse than a woman who planted them in the wrong place. She was wasteful. She was stubborn. She was, in Gideon Sauter's carefully circulated phrase, not thinking clearly about the girl. Tullough came one last time before the heavy cold. Together, they lashed the upper stalks with 3 bands of willow and rawhide, spaced a foot apart, reinforcing the lattice against the January wind that would hit harder than anything the stalks had yet faced. Tolliff insisted on leaving small openings at intervals, gaps the width of a fist where the bands did not close. Why? Beret asked. Because you do not want a solid wall, Tolliff said. A solid wall makes the wind angry. The wind hits it and pushes harder. But a wall with gaps lets the wind enter, slow, and drop what it carries. That is the trick. You are not stopping the wind. You are teaching it to put down its snow where you want it. He stepped back and looked at the finished rows. The lattice was rough, uneven, patched in places where broken stalks had been splinted with willow and cloth. It did not look like engineering. It looked like desperation organized by someone who understood geometry. Will it hold? Beret asked. Ask me in February, Tolliff said. The first real test came in December, and it came small. A 3-day blow pushed snow across the basin, laying down 3 inches on open ground. The stalks stood. The willow held. And inside the sunflower maze, where the rows were thickest on the north wall, 8 inches of snow collected, nearly 3 times what fell on the open ground. The snow packed against the stalks, filtered between them, and settled against the logs in a dense, wind-compressed drift that was not fluffy, but hard, like white clay. Beret pushed a knitting needle through the drift and measured the depth against Clara's school slate. 8 inches on the north wall, 6 on the west, 2 on the east. Nothing on the thinned south wall where the stalks were too sparse to catch more than scattered flakes. That evening she lit a candle and held it near the worst crack on the west wall, the gap that had breathed air since June. The flame bent toward the wall, pulled by the draft, but it bent less than before. The 6 inches of packed snow on the outside had not sealed the gap, but it had slowed the wind behind it. The air still moved, but it moved the way water moves through sand, filtered, weakened, robbed of its cutting edge. Inside, the cabin was still cold. But it was not the knifing cold of October, when wind had run through the room like a river. It was a duller cold, a heavier cold, the kind that a stove could argue with. Amos Pritchard heard about the drift from Martha Pell's boy Jasper, who had walked past on the way to the Enger place and stopped to stare at the white packed rows. Pritchard rode over the next day and examined the drift without dismounting. A drift is not a wall, he said. It is keeping wind out, Beret said. December wind is not January wind. January wind comes from a different country. Martha Pell said the first thaw would rot the logs. Gideon Sauter said snow against a house was what poor men got when they could not afford to shovel. The skeptics had new material, but the material was thinner than before. The drift was visible. The candle flame had steadied. The cabin was warmer. These were not arguments. They were facts, and facts were harder to laugh at than flowers. But the real test had not arrived. Riders coming down from the northern bench brought stories that settled over the basin like the smell of something burning. Cattle were drifting south, moving ahead of weather they could sense and men could not yet see. Hay racks stood empty on ranches that had expected an open winter. Wolves followed the weak stock, pulling down calves and yearlings that could not keep pace with the herds. Creeks froze hard enough to walk across, and the ice was growing thicker each week. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was building itself in the north, assembling the cold and the wind and the snow into something that would arrive with the force of a thing that had been gathering strength for months. The cattle ranchers called it weather. The old hands called it worse. The Blackfeet and Crow had names for winters like this that translated roughly to the white that eats. Tolliff stopped by on a day when the temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the creek solid overnight. He stood outside the cabin and looked at the sunflower wall the way a general looks at a fortification he has helped build but does not fully trust. If the first big wind comes before enough snow, he said, the stalks could snap clean. They need the snow to weigh them down. Without it, they are sticks in a gale. When will the wind come? Beret asked. When it is ready, Tolliff said. He pulled his collar up and walked back toward the road. His limp was worse in the cold. Each step looked like a negotiation with his own body. January 9th, 1887. The valley woke under a sky the color of dirty wool. The light was wrong, not dim, but thick, as though the air itself had become solid. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days, slow and steady, like a well running dry. Beret could feel it in the cabin walls, in the logs that radiated cold inward like stone. By noon, the sky lowered. By 2, snow began to fall, but not the way snow usually fell in the basin, gently, vertically, in flakes that drifted and landed. This snow moved sideways. It came from the northwest in sheets that were not falling but being thrown, driven by a wind that had no interest in negotiation. By 4, the wind had teeth. Beret fed the stove every 20 minutes. The cottonwood burned fast and gave weak heat, the same complaint she had carried since June, but now the complaint was not theoretical. She was watching her fuel disappear in real time, and the cold was not retreating. Clara sat on the pallet wrapped in every blanket they owned, coughing into the wool. Her forehead was hot. Her cheeks were flushed with the particular brightness that means fever, not health. The sound outside changed by early evening. The wind had been a whistle, high, thin, constant. Now it became something lower, a sound that vibrated in the chest rather than the ears. The sunflower stalks were making noise, not breaking, thrumming. The wind hit the rose, and the rose shuddered as a unit, the willow wands transferring the force from stalk to stalk, and the whole lattice produced a deep rhythmic hum that Beret could feel through the soles of her boots. She pressed her hand against the north wall. The logs vibrated, but they vibrated less than they had in December. Something was different. Then she heard it, or rather, she heard the absence of something she had heard every day for 7 months. The whistle of wind through the west wall cracks. The sound that had been the background noise of her entire life in this cabin was quieter, not gone, but changed, muffled, as though someone had pressed a hand over the cracks from the outside. She lit a candle and held it near the worst gap on the west wall. The flame leaned toward the wall, leaned but did not gutter, did not dance, did not lie sideways the way it had in October and November and December. Something was building outside. Beret unlatched the door and pushed it open against the wind. Snow hit her face in a horizontal sheet. She could see 5 feet, no more. But in those 5 feet she could see the north wall, and what she saw stopped her breathing. The sunflower rows were disappearing, not falling, being buried. Snow was striking the outer row of stalks, slowing, tangling in the lattice of woven willow and frozen stems, and packing into the spaces between. The wind drove more snow into the gaps, and the snow compacted against the previous layer, building a wall that was not stalk and not snow, but both, a dense, wind-hammered mass that was climbing the rows the way water climbs a sponge. By midnight, the north wall was buried under a drift as high as Beret's chest. The stalks were invisible beneath packed white. The logs behind the drift were sealed. No air moved through them. By 2 in the morning, the west wall was following. The wind had shifted slightly, driving snow into the west-facing rows at a sharper angle. The drift climbed to 2 feet, then higher. The stalks bowed under the weight, but held. pressed against each other by the willow wands and the sheer mass of the snow packing between them. Inside, the candle flame near the west wall stood straight, not still. The air still moved faintly, pulled by the stove draft. But the cutting wind was gone. The wall was sealed by snow packed into a lattice of dead flowers. Beret held her hand against the inside log where the worst crack had been. The wood was cold, but it was only cold. It was not breathing. No air passed through it. For the first time since she had stepped inside this cabin in June, the west wall was a wall. She fed the stove. The cottonwood caught and burned. And something happened that she had not experienced in 7 months of living in this cabin. The heat stayed. The stove pushed warmth into the room, and the warmth did not flee through the walls. It hung in the air. It thickened. The temperature rose. Clara's blankets became warm instead of just covering. The air near the ceiling grew hot enough that Beret could feel it on her face when she stood. She adjusted the stove damper for the first time, not to push more air through the firebox, which was all she had ever done, but to reduce it. She was making less fire. The cabin was getting warmer. Clara sweated through the fever. Her cough loosened. She slept without shaking. Beret sat on the floor near the stove and did arithmetic she had never been able to do before. The stove, when she fed it every 30 minutes, had kept the cabin at a temperature that was merely miserable. Now, with the wind blocked and the snow packed against 3 walls, she fed it every 2.5 hours, and the cabin was warm. Not survivable. Warm. The same wood, the same stove, the same cabin. The only difference was what stood outside the walls. At 3 a.m, someone pounded on the door. Beret opened it and found Amos Pritchard standing in the snow with Martha Pell's youngest boy in his arms. The child was 5 years old. His eyelashes were ice shut. His lips were blue. His hands were balled into fists inside mittens that were soaked through. He was not crying. Children who are truly cold stop crying. Martha's chinking blew out, Pritchard said. His voice was flat, stripped of the authority that usually structured it. The west wall, the clay cracked in the cold, and the wind tore it loose. The whole strip. The cabin is open. He stepped inside, and the warmth hit him like a physical thing. Beret saw it happen. His shoulders dropped. His jaw unclenched, his eyes widened. He had walked from his cabin to Martha's, and then from Martha's to Beret's, a total distance of more than 3 miles in a blizzard, carrying a child, and he had expected to find another cold cabin. He had expected to find survival conditions. What he found was warmth. He looked at the walls. He looked at the stove. He looked at the candle Beret had left burning near the west wall crack, its flame standing vertical and still. "How?" he said. Beret did not answer. She took the boy from Pritchard's arms and carried him to the stove. She stripped the frozen mittens off his hands and wrapped them in dry wool. She heated water and pressed a warm cloth against his face until his eyelashes thawed, and he opened his eyes. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because this is the moment Beret's strange wall stops being a joke and becomes a question of who lives through the night. Pritchard stood in the doorway, still wearing the cold like a coat he could not remove. He turned and looked outside, at the wall of packed snow and dead sunflower stalks that buried the north face of the cabin. In the lantern light, the snow glowed faintly, and the stalks jutted from it at angles, gray lines in a white field. "You did this," he said. Not a question, a reckoning. "The wind did it," Beret said. "I just told it where to put the snow." In that moment, Amos Pritchard's authority broke. Not loudly, not with argument or admission. It broke in silence, the way a man's certainty breaks when he walks into a room that should be cold and finds it warm, and realizes that the woman he had dismissed understood something he did not. Across the basin, the storm killed. A bachelor herder named Lute Farrow was found alive 3 days later in a dugout near Flat Willow Creek. His fingers were black with frostbite. He lost 2 on each hand. A cattle hand whose name Beret never learned was found dead near a haystack south of the Judith, frozen in a sitting position with his arms wrapped around his knees as though he had been trying to hold himself together. The cattle died in numbers no one could count that night. Hundreds, then thousands, piling against fences and coulees and creek banks, drifting south until the snow stopped them and the cold finished what the wind had started. Martha Pell's cabin survived because Pritchard carried her youngest to Beret's and then went back with oakum and blankets to stuff the blown chinking. Martha spent the night feeding her stove every 15 minutes, burning through wood at a rate that would leave her dangerously short by February. Her cabin was sealed again by morning, but the seal was temporary, and both she and Pritchard knew it. The storm blew for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind dropped, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Beret had ever heard. She opened the door and stepped outside into a world that was white and still and utterly changed. The sunflower wall was buried. On the north side, the drift reached the eaves. The stalks were invisible beneath 3 feet of compacted snow. On the west side, the drift was 2 feet high and packed so hard that Beret could stand on it without breaking through. The east side had a smaller drift, 18 inches, held in place by the thinner rows. The south side, where she had thinned the stalks on Tolef's advice, had almost no accumulation. The sun would reach those logs first when the thaw came. Beret pressed her palm against the inside of the north wall. Cold wood, still wood, no air moving. The snow had sealed her cabin tighter than any mortar Amos Pritchard could have mixed, and it had done it for free, using nothing but wind and dead flowers and the physics of a world that wanted to kill her. She had burned less than half the wood Pritchard had predicted she would need. Her worst wall was draft-free. Her daughter's fever had broken. And a boy who might have died in the cold was sleeping on her floor, wrapped in blankets, breathing steadily. The stove door glowed dull red. Beret sat on the floor beside it and did not move for a long time. The arithmetic had changed. Every number that had pointed at failure now pointed somewhere else. Not at safety, not at comfort, but at the narrow space between those things and dying where a person could stand if she knew exactly where to put her feet. Outside, the sunflower heads bowed under their burden of snow, gray stems pressed flat beneath the white weight. That was, for now, not a threat, but a shield. The wind had stopped. The snow held. The dead flowers had done what Amos Pritchard's 6 cords of hardwood and lime mortar and 2 hired men were supposed to do. They had kept the cold on the outside of the wall. The storm had been over for 2 days when Amos Pritchard came back. This time he brought a hand auger. He did not knock. He walked to the north wall of Beret's cabin, where the drift still stood chest high and solid, and he drilled a test hole through the packed snow and sunflower mass. The auger bit into the drift and turned slowly, grinding through compacted snow and frozen stalk fibers and willow fragments. White dust spiraled out around the shaft. When the bit broke through the other side, Pritchard pulled it out and measured the hole with a length of twine. He tied a knot at the depth, then wound the twine around his fist and walked to his own cabin. He returned an hour later. Martha Pell was with him, and so were 2 ranch hands from the Enger place, young men named Dahl and Rasmussen, who had ridden out to check on neighbors after the storm. They stood in a loose half-circle near the north wall, while Pritchard held up the twine. 26 inches of packed snow and stalk, he said. On our north wall. He held up a second piece of twine with a knot at a different point. This is my north wall, lime chinked, tight-fitted logs, no drift. The cold goes through it in 4 hours. Her wall held heat with 2 cords of punk cottonwood that I told her would not last through December. He paused. Pritchard was not a man who paused easily. Pausing meant acknowledging that the words he had already spoken were insufficient and that the words coming next would cost him something. I judged the wall, he said. I did not judge the wind. Martha Pell looked at the drift. She had the expression of a woman recalculating a sum she had been certain about. The rot, she said. The spring rot. The water will... She dug trenches, Pritchard said. She lined them with creek stone. She thinned the south wall so the sun hits the logs first. He looked at Beret, who stood in the doorway with Clara on her hip. You did that before the storm? Tolliff showed me, Beret said. The Norwegian? Pritchard asked. He built snow fences for the railroad. He knows how wind drops snow. Dahl, one of the ranch hands, walked to the west wall and put his hand against the drift. He pushed. The snow did not give. He knocked on it with his knuckles. It sounded like knocking on wood. That is wind-packed, he said. Like a sod wall, but colder. It is colder, Beret said, but it does not move. And cold that does not move is not what kills you. Moving cold kills you. Wind kills you. Rasmussen, the other ranch hand, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Could this work on any cabin? It worked on mine, Beret said. I do not know if it works on all cabins. The wind has to come from the right direction. The stalks have to be thick enough to catch snow, but open enough to let wind enter and slow down. And you have to drain the melt in spring, or the water rots everything. She said it plainly, without pride or salesmanship. She said it the way a woman says something she has tested with her own hands and does not need to exaggerate. Pritchard watched her speak and said nothing more. He had already said the hardest thing. The rest was arithmetic, and arithmetic did not require authority. It required honesty. The women came first. They came because they understood fuel scarcity in a way that men who cut wood did not. A man with an axe saw a tree and calculated cords. A woman with a stove saw a cord and calculated hours. How many hours of warmth? How many feedings? How many nights before the pile shrank past the point where rationing became starvation? The women of Cottonwood Creek and the Upper Judith had spent every winter of their frontier lives counting wood the way a prisoner counts days, and Beret's arithmetic, the same stove burning half the fuel for twice the warmth, spoke to them in a language they had been waiting to hear. Elna Anger came first, 3 days after the storm, walking 2 miles with her youngest wrapped in a blanket on her back. She had 4 children under 8 and a husband who cut wood when he was not tending cattle, which meant he did not cut enough wood. She asked Beret to show her the wall. Beret walked her around the cabin and let her feel the drift, push her hand into it, knock on it. Then she brought Elna inside and lit a candle near the sealed west wall crack. Watch the flame, Beret said. The flame stood straight. Elna stared at it the way a person stares at something that contradicts a fact they had accepted as permanent. She had lived her entire married life believing that winter cold was something you fought with more fuel, and the flame was telling her that the fight could be rigged. I do not have sunflower seed, Elna said. I have seed heads, Beret said. Take what you need, but the stalks take a full growing season. For this winter, you need brush, willow, dead corn stalks, anything stiff enough to stand in rows and catch snow. Tolliff can show you how to set them. Martha Pell came the next day. She did not bring pickled beets this time. She brought questions. She walked the perimeter slowly, the way she had walked it in July when the seeds were just planted. But this time she was not looking for reasons to doubt. She was looking for instructions. "Show me the drainage trench," she said. Beret showed her. Martha knelt and examined the flat stones, the pitch of the trench, the angle away from the sill. She asked about depth, about width, about what to do if the ground was still frozen when melt began. "Break the crust on the south side first," Beret said. "That wall gets sun. The north side stays frozen longest. Channel the water away before it pools. If it pools, it soaks into the wood and the rot starts." Martha nodded. She stood and brushed the snow from her knees. "I said your flowers would rot your house," she said. "You were right to worry about it," Beret said. "I was right about the risk. I was wrong about you. You already knew the risk, and you planned for it. I did not give you credit for that." Martha's conversion was the quiet kind. No dramatic admission, no public reversal. She simply began preparing her own cabin for brush screens on the windward side, using willow bundles and dried corn stalks from her garden. She never called it a snow fence. She called it the brecca method, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Small ranchers came after the women, men who could not afford to lose cattle and could not afford to rebuild cabins, men who had watched their chinking fail in the storm and had burned through January's wood in 2 days. They came to Beret's door and asked to see the wall, and she showed them, and then she showed them the flower and stalk demonstration she had built with Clara in June, the wash tub, the dried weeds, the flower settling behind the stalks where the blown air slowed. Beret taught the way Tolef had taught her, through demonstration, not lecture. She let people see the candle flame. She let them feel the wall. She let them push their hands into the drift and discover for themselves that it was not powder, but packed mass, dense enough to hold weight. The teaching was physical, and the converts were people who trusted their own hands more than anyone's words. A school trustee named Carr rode out in late January and spent an afternoon watching Beret demonstrate. He asked if the principal could work for the schoolhouse, which sat exposed on a bench with no windbreak and burned wood so fast that the district was considering shortening the winter term. Beret said she did not know. She said the schoolhouse was bigger than her cabin and the wind patterns might be different. She said he should talk to Tolef, who understood the engineering better than she did. She did not overstate what she knew. She did not claim the method was universal. She said every time that it had worked on her cabin because the wind direction, stalk density, snow type, and cabin shape had aligned, and that other cabins would need their own adjustments. The honesty made people trust her more than confidence would have. Gideon Sauter heard about Pritchard's measurement the same day it happened. Dollar Rasmussen told someone at the store, and the someone told Sauter, and Sauter stood behind his counter and processed the information the way a man processes news of an investment gone wrong. He had bet on Beret's failure. He had priced flour to accelerate it. He had crushed her seedlings with his boots and smiled while he did it. And now Amos Pritchard, the man whose judgment the entire basin trusted, had drilled a hole in a snowdrift and declared the sunflower wall a success. Sauter's first response was to reframe the story. He told customers at the store that he had always known brush breaks could help in winter. "My father used them in Illinois," he said, which may or may not have been true. He told Martha Pell that the real innovation was not the sunflowers, but the drainage trench, which he claimed was a common German technique. He positioned himself not as a man who had mocked a widow, but as a man who had been right about the principle all along and was simply concerned about the execution. His second response was commercial. Within a week of Pritchard's measurement, Sauter had a sack of sunflower seed on his counter, priced at 3 times what Beret had paid for hers at Fow's. He labeled it Mammoth Snow Fence Seed and told customers it was a special variety bred for height and stiffness. Beret undercut him without trying. She gave away seed heads from her own plants, the same plants Sauter had stepped on in August. She showed neighbors how to crack the heads and saved the fattest seed for planting. She did not charge because she had not paid for most of her seed. She had gathered it from road ditches and wild stands, and the generosity cost her nothing except the satisfaction of watching Sauter's overpriced sack sit unsold on his counter. Sauter did not forgive that. A man who loses the mockery battle can recover. A man who loses the commerce battle remembers. Tolef Vangen did not attend any of the teaching demonstrations. He came to Beret's cabin in the evenings after the visitors had gone, and together they worked on what he called the second design, not flowers against every wall, but a system. Windside rows only, willow braces at 3 heights, spring trenches with stone lining, removable brush panels for cabins where sunflowers would not grow, frames of willow and scrap wood that could be leaned against a wall in November and pulled away in April. They disagreed about density. Beret wanted the rows thick. She had seen the north wall's performance. 162 stalks packed tight, snow piled to the eaves. And she wanted to replicate that concentration on every windward face. Thicker is not better, Tolef said. They were sitting at Beret's table in the evening, drawing diagrams in the flower dust. Clara was asleep. The stove ticked. Thick stops wind. Stopped wind jumps. Jumped wind lands on the other side and scours the ground bare. You do not want to stop the wind. You want to tire it. The north wall stopped the wind, and it worked, Beret said. The north wall worked because your cabin is small, and the drift covered everything before the scour started. A bigger building, a barn, a schoolhouse. The thick wall makes the problem worse on the far side. You need open rows that let wind through slowly, like a sieve, not a dam. Then how do you know how open? Beret asked. You test it. You try a density. You watch where the snow falls. If it piles right against the stalks and nothing reaches the wall behind, the rows are too tight. If the snow passes through and lands 50 feet behind, the rows are too open. You want the snow to fall between the stalks and the wall, in the space where the wind is tired but not dead. They argued about it for 2 evenings. It was not a hostile argument. It was the argument of 2 people who respected each other's observations but drew different conclusions. Tolef thought in principles, wind physics, snow mechanics, the behavior of moving air against barriers. Beret thought in results. The north wall had worked. The specific density that had worked should be repeated. Both were right in their own frame. The tension between their approaches produced something better than either would have built alone. A flexible design that could be adapted to different buildings, different wind patterns, and different materials. They built a model on the cabin floor one evening using dried stalks, sand, and a piece of tin bent into a curve to represent a cabin wall. Clara woke up and watched from her pallet. Tolef blew across the model from different angles while Beret marked where the sand collected. They adjusted the stalk spacing, blew again, marked again. After an hour, they had a pattern. Dense on the windward corner, medium along the windward face, sparse approaching the lee side, nothing on the lee wall itself. Now we have a design, Tolef said. Now we have a design that works on a cabin floor, Beret said. We need to see if it works outside. Yeah, Tolef said. That is always the problem. In those evenings, Tolef's backstory emerged the way backstories emerge between people who work together, in pieces, offered without being asked for, dropped into silences that felt safe enough to fill. He had come from Trondheim as a boy of 16. He had worked lumber camps in Wisconsin, track gangs in Dakota, and section crews across Montana. He had a wife once, a woman named Sigri, who had died of typhoid in a railroad camp near Miles City in 1879. He had no children. He had a hip that had been broken by a rail tie that fell from a crane in 1882 and had healed crooked because the company doctor said it drunk. He told Beret these things not for sympathy, but for context. He was explaining why he knew what he knew, that his knowledge of wind and snow and barriers came from years of keeping railroad track clear, and that his willingness to help came from the fact that his knowledge had been useless since the railroad decided his body was no longer worth the cost of keeping him employed. A man who knows something and cannot use it, Tolov said, is a man carrying wood in a desert. Beret understood. She was a woman who had needed something and could not buy it. He was a man who had something and could not sell it. The partnership worked because both sides were desperate in different ways, and desperation, on the frontier, was a more reliable bond than affection. Tolov's lungs had been bad since the winter of 1883, when he spent 3 weeks clearing track in a blizzard near Billings and breathed cold air until something inside him stopped working correctly. He coughed in the mornings, a deep, wet sound that was different from Clara's cough. Clara coughed because the air was cold and her chest was small. Tolov coughed because something inside him was damaged and would not repair. In early March, during the first thaw, Tolov helped Beret cut drainage channels around 3 cabins, her own, Martha's, and Elna Enger's. The work required breaking the crust on the south-facing snowpack, shoveling channels through the frozen drift, and pitching the drainage away from the sill logs. It was heavy work for a young person. For a 61-year-old man with a crooked hip and damaged lungs, it was something close to suicide dressed as generosity. He collapsed near the creek on the second day. Beret found him sitting on the bank with his legs in the water, breathing in shallow pulls that sounded like cloth tearing. His face was gray. His hands were shaking. He looked at Beret with the expression of a man who knows exactly what is happening and does not have the energy to be angry about it. She carried him to her cabin. Not carried, guided, supported, half-dragged, his arm across her shoulders and his weight pulling her sideways with each step. She put him on Clara's pallet near the stove and covered him with every blanket she had. He did not argue. He did not say he was fine. He closed his eyes and breathed, and the sound of his breathing filled the cabin like the sound of the stalks in the wind, a thin, constant effort that was holding something together. He lived for 2 days. On the second morning, he opened his eyes and looked at the walls, still ringed with gray stalks outside the windows, still showing the waterline where the snow had been packed against the logs. "Do not trust the snow after it softens," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. It was not a deathbed declaration. It was a final lesson, delivered with the same practical specificity as every other lesson he had taught her. The snow that saved you in January will rot you in April if you let it. Watch the south wall. Break the crust. Cut the channels. The snow is an ally only as long as it is frozen and you are smarter than the calendar. He died that afternoon. Clara was sitting in the doorway drawing shapes in the mud with a stick. The same thing she had been doing the day Martha Pell first came to look at the sunflower planting. Beret was sitting beside Tolov's pallet, holding a cup of water she had warmed on the stove. He stopped breathing the way a fire goes out when the last coal seeds to ash, not suddenly, but by degrees, each breath smaller than the one before, until the difference between breathing and not breathing was too small to measure. Beret sat beside him for a long time after. The cabin was warm. The stove ticked. Through the window, she could see the sunflower stalks leaning at angles where the snowpack had shifted during the thaw, gray and stripped and still standing. They had done their work. Tolov had done his. Both were finished now, and what remained was the knowledge they had left behind, lodged in Beret's hands and Beret's memory, where it would have to be enough. She buried him on the slope above the creek, in a spot where the morning sun hit first and the wind came last. She dug the grave herself because the ground was thawing and she could, and because asking for help would have meant explaining Tolef to people who had not known him, and she did not yet have the words. The secondary crisis arrived 8 days after Tolef's death, and it arrived the way he had warned it would. A Chinook wind blew in from the west on a Tuesday afternoon, warm, sudden, wrong. The temperature climbed 30 degrees in 4 hours. The snowpack that had saved the cabins in January began to soften, then sag, then weep. Water ran from the drifts like blood from a wound, pooling against sill logs, soaking into the ground under foundations, turning the carefully maintained drainage channels into muddy rivers that overflowed their banks. At Beret's cabin, the south wall drainage held. She had maintained Tolef's channels through February, clearing them weekly, reinforcing the stone lining after each freeze-thaw cycle. The water ran away from the sill into the trench and downhill toward the creek. The south wall logs were damp but draining, but Gideon Sauter's storehouse was not draining. Sauter had copied Beret's idea after the storm, or rather, he had copied the part of it he could see. He had piled brush against the windward wall of his storehouse, let the snow pack into it, and declared himself clever. But he had not dug trenches. He had not lined the drainage with stone. He had not thinned the south wall. He had taken the visible half of the method and ignored the invisible half, because the invisible half required the kind of labor that Sauter paid others to do, and he had not paid anyone. Now the snow was melting against his storehouse wall with nowhere to go. The water pooled, soaked through the lowest logs, and reached the flour sacks stored against the interior wall. 20 sacks of flour, Sauter's winter inventory, the goods he sold to every homesteader in the settlement, were wicking water from the bottom up. By Wednesday morning, the bottom row was soaked. By Thursday, mold had started. Sauter blamed Beret. He rode to the Enger place and told the men there that the sunflower woman's method was destroying buildings across the settlement. He said the snow fence idea was reckless, that piling snow against walls was the practice of fools, and that his storehouse was proof. But Amos Pritchard was at the Enger place when Sauter arrived, and Pritchard asked the question that ended the argument. "Did you dig the drain she told you to dig?" Sauter said nothing. "She told you," Pritchard said. "She told everyone. South wall first, drainage trench, stone lining, break the crust before full thaw." "You were there when she said it, Gideon. You were standing at the back of the group, and you did not ask a single question because asking questions would have meant admitting she knew something you did not." Sauter's mouth moved, but no words came. The men at the Enger place watched him the way an audience watches a man lose a hand of cards he had bet too much on. The silence was worse than any insult because it contained no opinion. It was simply the sound of facts arranging themselves in an order that Sauter could not rearrange. He rode home. His flour continued to mold. Beret, meanwhile, had a settlement to save. Without Tolef, she was the only person in the Cottonwood Creek drainage who understood the full method. Not just the planting and the catching, but the drainage, the timing, the difference between snow that protects and water that destroys. She organized work crews the way Tolef would have. She walked each cabin's perimeter and assessed the melt pattern. She assigned priorities. South-facing walls first, then east, then west, then north last, because the north snow stayed frozen longest and could wait. She showed people how to break the crust with a hoe, not a shovel. A shovel took too much and exposed the logs too fast, but a hoe cracked the surface and let the melt run off slowly. She taught Martha's oldest boy, Jasper, to cut drainage channels. She taught Elna Enger to pull the stalks from the south wall before full thaw, leaning them against a fence to dry for next season's brush panels. She taught Doll, the ranch hand, to read the snow by texture: powder that insulates, crust that cuts, wet snow that rots. Each lesson was something Tolef had taught her. Each time she spoke his instructions, she heard his voice underneath her own, the vowels, the pauses, the practical precision of a man who had learned everything he knew by watching things go wrong and remembering what went wrong so he could prevent it next time. If the story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival often begins months before the danger arrives. The thaw crisis lasted 10 days. 3 cabins suffered minor water damage, damp sill logs that would need to dry and be treated with lime wash. 1 root cellar flooded. Sauter's flour loss was the worst damage in the settlement, and it was the only damage caused by the method itself. Every other problem was caused by the thaw acting on cabins that had no snow fence at all, where the natural snowdrift had piled against walls with no drainage plan. By the end of March, the snow was gone from every wall except the deepest northern drifts, which lingered in the shade like guests who had overstayed. The sunflower stalks stood exposed again, gray, stripped, leaning at angles where the snowpack had pushed them. They looked like the skeleton of something that had once been alive and was now merely structural. Beret walked the perimeter and counted. Of the 511 stalks that had stood at first frost, 403 remained upright. The rest had snapped under the snow weight or rotted at the base where water had pooled despite the trenches. 403 survivors out of 600 planted, a loss rate that would be acceptable in any crop. And these were not a crop. They were a wall that had held when lime mortar and seasoned hardwood and Amos Pritchard's professional expertise had not been available, and when the alternative was a dead child and a frozen cabin. Beret pulled the weakest stalks and stacked them for kindling. She left the strongest standing. She walked the drainage trenches and cleared them of debris. She marked on the inside of the cabin door a new set of numbers, the stalk count for next season's planting, adjusted for everything she had learned. She was no longer a widow trying to survive. She was a woman who had survived and was now teaching others how to do the same. The shift had happened without ceremony, without announcement, without anyone naming it. It had happened the way all real changes happen on the frontier, through work, through proof, and through the slow, grudging admission of people who had been wrong. But Gideon Sauter had not finished. He had lost the mockery battle. He had lost the commerce battle. He had lost the public argument with Pritchard at the Enger place. But he still held Beret's debt ledger, and the numbers in it had not changed. $11.60, signed in Aaron Brika's hand, owed to Gideon Sauter's general store. The debt was small, but small debts on the frontier were the teeth of traps. They did not kill quickly. They held you in place while something else finished the job. Spring turned the Judith Basin green in stages. First the creek bottoms, where water ran close and the soil remembered warmth, then the benches, where the grass came back thin and uncertain, and finally the high ground, where snow lingered in pockets, and the earth was the last to believe that winter was finished. By May of 1887, the basin looked almost normal. The dead cattle had been dragged into coulees or left to decompose where they fell, and the bones would surface for years afterward, white lines in the grass that marked the places where the great die-up had extracted its price. But the settlement along Cottonwood Creek did not look normal. It looked changed. On cabin after cabin, the windward walls showed the marks of Beret's method: willow brush lashed to stakes, dried corn stalks bundled and leaned against logs, drainage trenches dug along sill lines. Some had used sunflower stalks saved from Beret's surplus. Some had improvised with sagebrush and scrap lumber. The materials varied. The principle did not: make the wind drop its snow where the snow can serve you, then drain it before thaw. Bered's cabin became a teaching stop that spring and summer, though she never called it that and would have been uncomfortable with the word. People came. She showed them things. They left knowing more than when they arrived. The process was informal, unscheduled, and entirely driven by the fact that word travels on the frontier the way water travels downhill, toward the lowest point of need, and without anyone directing it. She kept a board on the inside wall near the door. Not the tally of stalks she had maintained through the growing season, but a reference chart she had built with Tolef during those evening sessions at her table. It showed wind directions marked by compass point, planning distances for different stalk heights, and spacing ratios for dense versus open rows. The drawings were crude. Beret was not an artist, but they were precise, and precision was what people needed more than beauty. A typical teaching day looked like this. A family would arrive, usually the wife first, sometimes with the husband following at a distance that said he was interested but not willing to admit it. Beret would walk them around her cabin, showing the stalk rows. Replanted now, new seeds in the ground, the second generation already pushing through the dirt. She would show them the drainage trench, the stone lining, the pitch away from the sill. She would take them inside and light the candle near the west wall crack and let them watch the flame. Then she would bring out the washtub. The washtub demonstration had become her signature, though she did not think of it that way. She set dried stalks in dirt, sprinkled flour, and had the visitor blow across the surface. Every time the flour settled behind the stalks, every time the visitor's face changed, the moment when theory became physical, when a principle they had heard described became something they could see with their own eyes and feel with their own breath. She taught Martha Pell's boy, Jasper, to set a candle near the floor to locate drafts. The flame always told the truth. Where the flame bent, the air moved. Where the air moved, heat escaped. The candle cost nothing and required no expertise, and Jasper carried the technique home and found 3 drafts in his family's cabin that had been bleeding warmth for 2 winters. She taught Amos Pritchard, who came not as a skeptic now, but as a student, though he would never have used that word, to leave gaps in a brush screen rather than packing it solid. Pritchard's instinct was to build tight, the way he built cabin walls, but Beret showed him with the wash tub that a solid barrier made the flour pile up at the base of the stalks instead of settling between the stalks and the wall behind them. A solid wall caught snow in the wrong place. An open screen guided it to the right place. "You're not building a wall," Beret told him. "You're building a trap. And a trap works by letting the animal enter before it closes." Pritchard nodded slowly. He was learning from a woman half his age who had arrived in the basin with $17 and a cracked stove, and the fact that he was willing to learn said more about his character than anything he had said during the months when he had doubted her. She taught school children to read snow by texture. She took them outside after a storm and had them push their hands into different drifts. Powder, light, dry, full of air, was the best insulator. It trapped warmth the way wool traps warmth, by holding still air in small pockets. Crust, the hard shell that formed when sun warmed the surface and cold refroze it, was the worst. Crust was a lid that sealed moisture against the wood underneath and accelerated rot. Wet snow, the heavy clumping snow that fell during thaws, was dangerous not because of its weight, but because of what it became when it melted. Water. And water, against wood, was time running backward. "Snow is 3 things," Beret told the children: a blanket, a knife, and a thief. Your job is to know which one is touching your wall. The children remembered that sentence long after they had forgotten the arithmetic of stalk spacing and trench depth. It was the kind of sentence that lodged in the mind because it was true and strange and useful all at once. Gideon Sauter's storehouse never fully recovered from the spring mold. He salvaged what he could, maybe half the flour, the top sacks that had stayed dry, but the loss was visible and the cause was public. Amos Pritchard's question at the Enger place had spread through the settlement the way Sauter's own gossip had spread the previous summer, and the irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had mocked Beret's method had been the only person damaged by it, and the damage was his own fault. Through the summer, Sauter tried several strategies to recover his position. He offered to sell pre-built brush panels at his store, Maus, willow frames lashed with rawhide. But the price was $3 each, and anyone with access to a creek could build one in an afternoon for free. He offered to buy sunflower seed in bulk from farmers and resell it as certified snow fence seed, but Beret was giving seed away, and free is a price no merchant can compete with. In August, Sauter tried a different approach. He rode to Beret's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, tied his horse to the same stump he had used the previous summer, and sat on the stump with his ledger in his lap. "Mrs. Breke," he said, "I have come to discuss your account." Beret was splitting willow wands for the second season's bracing. She did not stop working. "The account is $11.60, she said. "I know the number." "I'm prepared to cancel half the debt," Sauter said. $5.80, written off, gone. Beret set down the hatchet. She looked at him. She had learned, over the past year, to read Sauter's offers the way Tolliff had taught her to read wind, by watching what moved behind the surface. "In exchange for what?" she said. "Your endorsement, a letter signed by you, stating that Sauter's General Store provided the seed and supplies that made the snow fence method possible. I will display it in the store. Customers will see that the Breke method, Nawasan, he used the name Martha had given it, and it cost him something to say it, was built with Sauter's support." "You crush my seedlings with your boots," Beret said. "You raise my flour price. You told Martha I was not thinking clearly about my daughter. You offered to buy my claim for $30 when you knew it was worth 10 times that." Sauter's face did not change. He was a man who had been caught in a lie and had decided that the best response was to pretend the lie had never been told. "Business is business, Mrs. Breke. I made an offer. You refused. That is how commerce works." "You did not make an offer. You made a bet. You bet I would fail, and you priced everything to make sure I did. The flour, the seed, the credit. Every number in your ledger was a finger on the scale." Sauter closed the ledger. He looked at the sunflower rows, the second season's planting, already waist-high green and thick along the north and west walls. He looked at the drainage trench, freshly cleared. He looked at the reference board visible through the open cabin door. "I will not endorse your store," Beret said, "and I will pay the $11.60 when I have it. Not before." Sauter rode home. The offer sat on his counter like the unsold sunflower seed, rejected, visible, and humiliating. The resolution came in October, and it came not from Beret but from the community she had built without trying. Martha Pell, Amos Pritchard, Elna Inger, and 6 other homesteaders along the Cottonwood Creek drainage signed witness statements supporting Beret's improvements and character for her homestead claim. The statements were practical documents, required for proving up, but they were also a public declaration. They said in legal language that Beret Breke had resided on her claim, improved her property, farmed her land, and contributed to the welfare of the settlement. Amos Pritchard's statement included a sentence that he had written himself. Mrs. Brecke's innovation in wind management has improved winter survival conditions for no fewer than 9 households in this drainage. The statements arrived at Sauter's awareness the way all community actions arrive at the awareness of the person they are directed against, through whisper, through implication, through the slow realization that the ground had shifted. 9 households, 9 families who bought supplies. 9 families who could, if they chose, buy those supplies from the merchant in Lewistown instead of from Gideon Sauter. Sauter canceled the debt in November. He did not ride out to Beret's cabin. He sent a note with a freighter, written in his careful hand. Account settled in full, no balance owed. He did not include an apology or an explanation. He did not need to. The note was the apology, rendered in the only language Sauter spoke fluently, commerce. When Beret heard that Sauter had told a customer at the store, "Seems her flowers were worth more standing dead than mine were in sacks," she did not laugh. She folded the note and put it in the leather envelope where she kept the claim receipt, beside the $17.40 she no longer needed to hoard. The 2 documents, chas, the claim, and the canceled debt, one were the beginning and the end of the same story. A woman who had arrived with nothing but paper and desperation now had paper that meant something different, not wealth, not safety, but the absence of the trap that had been set for her, sprung by the man who set it, because the community had decided that her value was greater than his leverage. Orrin Cady arrived in the Cottonwood Creek settlement in April of 1888, a full year after Tolliffe's death. He was 32 years old, a blacksmith and widower from Lewistown, who had heard about the sunflower cabin from a freighter, who had heard about it from a ranch hand, who had heard about it from Amos Pritchard. The story had traveled the way all frontier stories traveled, through repetition, embellishment, and the particular gravity that pulls useful information toward people who need it. Cady was not looking for Beret. He was looking for work. The settlement needed a blacksmith, and Lewistown had 3. He had a wagon, a portable forge, an anvil that weighed 200 pounds, and a set of tongs his father had made in Pennsylvania. He was a quiet man, not shy, but economical with words in the way that people who work with their hands often are, as though language were a material that should not be wasted. He found Beret's cabin by accident, or by the kind of accident that happens when a man follows a road and stops at the most interesting thing he sees. The sunflower rows were in their 2nd season, taller than the first year, denser on the windward sides, with the willow bracing visible between the stalks like the ribs of a ship. He stopped his wagon and stared. Beret was on the roof, replacing a shingle that had cracked during the thaw. She had a hammer in one hand and a cedar shake in the other, and she was straddling the ridgepole with the confidence of someone who had climbed up there enough times to stop being afraid. "That is a snow fence," Cady said from the ground. Beret looked down at him. "You know snow fences." "I shod horses for a railroad section crew in '84. They built slat fences along exposed grades. Your fence is not slats. It is sunflowers." Cady looked at the rows again. He walked closer and examined the willow bracing, the spacing, the way the stalks were staggered in 4 rows. He touched one of the willow wands and flexed it. "Who designed the bracing?" he asked. "A man named Tolliff Vangen. He built snow fences for the Northern Pacific." "The bracing needs iron," Cady said. "Not for the stalks. The stalks flex, that's right. But the anchor points, where the willow meets the ground posts, those joints are rawhide, and rawhide stretches when it gets wet. An iron staple would hold through the thaw without loosening." Beret came down from the roof. She stood in front of Cady and looked at him with the particular attention of a woman who has spent a year talking to people about her method and can tell within 30 seconds whether the person she is talking to understands it or is merely curious about it. Cady understood it. He understood it from the materials up, which was how a blacksmith understood everything, by knowing what each piece was made of and where it would fail. "Can you make iron staples?" she asked. "I can make anything you can draw," Katie said. He set up his forge at the Enger place, which had a shed large enough to shelter the anvil, and within a week he was making staples, hinges, and bracket frames for removable brush panels. The brush panels had been Tolef and Beret's design, willow and scrap wood frames that could be leaned against a wall in November and pulled away in April. But the frames had always been weak at the joints where rawhide lashings stretched and loosened. Katie's iron staples solved the problem the way iron always solves problems in wood construction, by being harder than the forces trying to pull the joint apart. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through shared work. Katie made staples. Beret tested them. Katie redesigned the bracket when the first version pulled free under snow load. Beret told him the snow load on the north wall was heavier than he had calculated and showed him the numbers scratched on her cabin door. He recalculated. She tested again. The bracket held. They argued about materials the way she and Tolef had argued about density, not with anger, but with the productive friction of two people who knew different things and were building something that required both kinds of knowledge. Katie knew iron and wood and the physics of joints. Beret knew wind and snow and the behavior of barriers in moving air. Neither could build what the settlement needed without the other. He fixed her stove in June. The crack that had plagued her since she arrived, the fracture in the firebox wall that let smoke seep into the cabin and reduced the draft, had been a constant low-grade problem that she had worked around but never solved. Katie examined it, heated a piece of iron plate on his forge, and riveted a patch over the crack that sealed it completely. The stove drew properly for the first time. The improvement in heat output was immediate and startling. "You have been burning extra wood for 2 years to compensate for a crack I could have fixed in an hour," Katie said. "I did not have a blacksmith," Beret said. "You do now," Katie said. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact that contained within its practical surface everything that a declaration of love contains: the offer of presence, the promise of capability, the willingness to stay. Beret heard all of it. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the stove, drawing clean and hot for the first time, and she thought about Tolef, who had taught her to build a wall out of wind and flowers, and about Aaron, who had died carrying the lime and nails that were supposed to make the wall unnecessary. They married in the autumn of 1888, in a ceremony at the Enger place attended by Martha Pell, Amos Pritchard, Elna Enger, and 14 other homesteaders who had learned some version of the Breck method. Clara stood beside her mother in a dress Martha had sewn from flour sack cotton, holding the wooden button she still carried in her apron pocket, the button from Aaron's toolbox that she had held the day the deputy brought the foreclosure notice, the day Pritchard delivered his verdict, the day Sauter crushed the seedlings. They kept the Brecka place. Katie built a forge shed on the east side of the cabin, where the wind was weakest and the sunflower rows were thinnest. He made tools for the settlement: hinges, hasps, staples, hooks, plow points, axe heads, and he made the iron frames for the removable brush panels that became the standard winter preparation for every cabin in the drainage. The panels could be assembled in October and stored in a shed by April, and they required no growing season, no planting, no water. They were the method industrialized, adapted for people who did not have Beret's patience or Tolef's knowledge, but who could follow instructions and hammer iron staples into wood. By the second winter, Beret's method had spread beyond the 9 households Pritchard had counted. Families along the Judith River heard about it from the Cottonwood Creek settlers. A rancher near Grass Range built a modified version using lodgepole pine poles instead of sunflower stalks. A woman near Gilt Edge planted sunflowers along the north and west walls of her chicken coop and reported that her hens laid through January for the first time. The method was not a revolution, it was one tool among many: chinking when affordable, brush breaks when available, snow management when desperate. It did not make winter safe. Nothing made winter safe. It gave poor settlers one more defense, one more way to survive the gap between what they could afford and what they needed. And on the frontier, the distance between those two numbers was where most people lived their entire lives. Clara grew up knowing how to read wind before clouds. She could tell by the way the grass bent on the bench above the cabin whether the next storm would come from the northwest, the killing direction, or from the southwest, which brought warmer snow that melted too fast. She could feel a draft with her hand the way other children could feel a pulse, finding the invisible rivers of moving air that stole warmth from a cabin the way a pickpocket steals from a crowd. She learned these things from her mother, who had learned them from Tulliff, who had learned them from 23 years of watching snow bury railroad track and figuring out how to make it bury something useful instead. By the next winter, at least 9 cabins in the Cottonwood Creek settlement used some version of Beret's windside planting or brush screen. Not all used sunflowers. Some used willow. Some used corn stalks. Some used Orrin Katie's iron-framed brush panels, which required no living plant at all. What spread was not a technique but a principle. The wind will always bring snow, and snow will always pile against whatever stands in its path, and if you choose what stands in its path, you choose where the snow goes, and if you choose where the snow goes, you can make the thing that was trying to kill you into the thing that keeps you alive, but only if you drain it before it melts. That part, people learned the hard way or learned from Beret. There was no third option. Beret Brecka lived out her life on the Judith Basin claim. She proved up on the homestead in 1891 with Amos Pritchard's witness statement in the file. She and Orrin had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up in a cabin that was warm in winter and ringed with sunflowers in summer. Each autumn, after the seed heads were harvested and the stalks had dried to gray, Beret left one row standing on the north wall. Not because she needed it. The cabin was properly chinked now, the stove repaired, the wood supply adequate. She left it because Clara's children liked to walk through the dry stalks and hear them rattle, and because the sound reminded Beret of the winter when the rattling meant the stalks were catching snow, and the snow was catching wind, and the wind was being taught for the first time to put down its burden where a woman had told it to. Gideon Sauter had said it in August of 1886, standing in a row of crushed seedlings with his boots dirty and his smile certain. You cannot eat yellow flowers in January. He was right. You cannot eat them. But on the 9th of January, 1887, when the wind came from the northwest at a speed that killed cattle where they stood and froze a man solid against a haystack and tore the chinking from Martha Pell's cabin wall. On that night, Beret Brecka's yellow flowers were not food. They were not decoration. They were not the garden where a wall ought to be. They were 500 dead stalks woven with willow and weighted with snow, standing in 4 rows around a 16 by 20-foot cabin on Cottonwood Creek, holding the wind's own weapon against the wind's own attack. Inside, the stove glowed. Clara slept. The candle flame stood straight, and Beret pressed her palm against the wall, where daylight had once shone through the cracks and felt no wind at all. Outside, the sunflower heads bowed under snow like a crowd of witnesses, frozen in place around the cabin they were never meant to decorate. In Montana that winter, the flowers did not bloom. They stood guard,